There is so much growth and learning within our subjects that cannot be measured by a number.
When you teach students how to learn, especially students that perhaps have struggled for a really long time with keeping the knowledge in their brain because they just haven't had the right techniques or been given the right support, you suddenly just start to see them flourish, and their data starts to tell a very, very different story.
You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, Educator, Leader, Consultant and Coach.
In this episode, we're delighted to welcome Rowena Bracken and Lissie Doyle, both based in Australia. Head of Arts at St Margaret's Anglican Girls' School in Brisbane, Rowena is an arts educator with 25 years of experience teaching drama and well-being globally. She champions the transformative power of the arts to foster agency, creativity, and critical reflection in young people.
Meanwhile, Lissie began her career in outdoor education and now teaches health and physical education at Cardinia International College. She's always exploring how teaching practices can further shape safe, supportive spaces where students thrive. So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen.
So it's fantastic to have you both here. And I wonder if we can kick off with a question that's very linked to the subjects that you specialise in and that you love so much. So I wonder if we could begin with those subjects, with arts and physical and health education. What does data look like in your world? Not just in terms of what's collected, but what's noticed or felt or left out. What does data mean in the world of an arts or PhE educator?
I can start with that one, Matthew. I think there's a lot of data seen, observational data, literally just seeing students jumping up to get on with a task, arriving early to class, not wanting to leave class, the energy that you can feel in a room. It's not just the numbers at the end of the assessment task. So I think there is that too, but it's very much about a feeling and what you see in the room.
Does that resonate with you as well, Lissie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both our spaces are not in the traditional, classes are not done in the traditional way, I guess, in that we both use a different form of creativity. So I think in the health and physical education classroom, we see really similar things. The energy that comes to a class. So we see that data in the laughter, the smiles, the frustrations, the not able to deal perhaps with strong emotions when you're a young teenage boy and you're in a competitive situation and you're finding that really challenging, or girl, I should say. So we see it coming out in all those different sorts of ways as well. But I guess we're also the other half of our classes are in the classroom space. So we have some outside or in gymnasiums and the other half are inside, where we're talking about really interesting and tough subjects, particularly around health and sexuality and identity and, the sex, drugs and rock and roll, all that sort of stuff. And so the data that we're working with there is actually really, really complicated data because we have to be very aware of what we're saying and what our children are saying to each other about each other and those conversations, and be ready to support and encourage, as well as trying to keep open minds and all those sorts of things as well. So really complex spaces for us as well in terms of reading that data.
It's an interesting sort of way of thinking about it because you're really talking about conversations and interactions as data, right? And so you're talking about something that I think every teacher has experienced, where you're reading the room and trying to gauge engagement levels and then responding to that in real time. But then there's this other piece to it, which is of all of that data that sort of washes past you, how much of that do you capture? How much of that do you record? What are some of the ways you think about that in terms of what's important to document somehow for later, and what parts of it are just sort of in the flow?
Yeah. I think it's really, really hard, Paul, because I think we have to be really careful as teachers. We need to follow our gut and respond to our students, but equally we need to be really careful about following our gut, because sometimes our gut does tell us the wrong thing about what our students need at specific parts of certain lessons. And that's when, like, when we see that they look engaged or they're on busy tasks, but perhaps they're not actually deep in the learning or deep in the activities that we're using to prompt them to think, then we need to be using data to check that they are actually in that space with us and they're not daydreaming about what's going to happen after school or on the weekend or whatever else. So there's this really hard space where you're following what your gut is saying and your experience tells you, but then you're needing to actually turn that into real live data and ask the students to give you something that's going to actually prove that hypothesis, I guess, that you've made in that minute, or it's going to make you slightly go on a different track because perhaps they haven't got what you wanted them to get.
I can't resist coming in here a bit just to come back to the idea of like gut knowledge and head knowledge. I find that kind of dichotomy really, really interesting. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, in fact, where rationalist philosophers argue that it's the knowing through this that really matters. It's the knowing through the head that tells us the truth. And the empiricists who argued it's the knowing through the gut, through the feeling, through the senses that matters. And head won over gut back then and has continued to win ever since. But I wonder whether actually gut knowledge is fallible, sometimes gets it right, sometimes gets it wrong, but so could be said of head knowledge, of the traditional quantifiable data that we collect and we put on our mark books and we submit on transcripts, etc. That's just as fallible, isn't it? So it's why I often struggle with the idea of hard and soft, because one suggests one is hard and it's reliable, it's truthful, and the other is soft because it's a little bit woolly and emotional. How does that play out in your two spaces?
I love it. I think that you're 100% right. I think that sometimes your gut is right and sometimes it's wrong. And I think sometimes our brains are right, or the knowledge that's up here is right and sometimes it's wrong. And I think that the data shows, like if you're looking at summative data from a test or something, the data like represents what the student was going through in that moment on that day as much as anything. If they're having a terrible day, then their results are not going to be great. And that's not indicative of what they are as a student or what they're capable of as a human. So I think it is really flawed in that sense. And I guess that's why I don't know that there's a perfect educational system out there that takes all of these things into account. You know, we're all trying, but at the end of the day, the system that I'm part of in Victoria, the VCE, it's done on a series of tests and written assignments and whatever over the course of the year, and luckily it's spread out, and every student has one bad one where they're feeling unwell or emotionally they're not, or they're tired or whatever. So I think data is always flawed, and we can also always interpret it. Not always, but perhaps we can interpret it how we want to see it as well. We can put our own bias and our own lens on it and make it seem something that it's not, because that's what we really want it to say. Yeah.
I wonder if, we talked about, or you described this, Matthew, as like the head and the gut. I mean, to a certain extent, it also seems like there's the evidence that you can explain, and then there's the inexplicable. There's that sort of intuitive sense where you feel like you know something, but you're not quite sure. So it becomes sort of this, almost like a black box where like, you get to the answer, but you're not entirely sure how you got there, right? And I think we've all like had, as educators, we've had that time where, we have our whole lesson plan and then we realize, this is not, something isn't working here. We have to sort of ad-lib or go off script a little bit because what's needed right now is not what I had anticipated needing, which is, again, reacting based on that kind of intuitive sense of data. I guess one of my worries in all of this, too, is just thinking about things like confirmation bias and other biases that we have. And, I've definitely experienced it and seen it as well, where teachers have this sort of sense like, yeah, I'm nailing it. That was great. And they just simply didn't see like that half the class were just sitting there while the other half of the class were engaged in the conversation. Yeah, I mean, maybe it comes back to what you were talking about before, Lizzie, about finding that balance somewhere, right? It's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think there's one of those things like you can't actually hide when you're using videos. And so I've started using a lot of videos in my classroom just of me to see what I'm missing. Like I just want to keep exploring how I can be better in my craft. And so I pop it at the back, and it's so interesting and awkward when you're rewatching those videos and seeing what you have missed and how you are so lost in your own thought or the words that are coming out of your mouth that you actually missed all these other things that are going on. And I think like having that ability to be self-reflective, but I think also putting it back on the students to check them for their understanding. I mean, one of my favourite tools in the classroom at the moment is definitely mini whiteboards. And just so I can do that, I can ask a question that clarifies if the knowledge has been taken on or not, and I can ask it 3 or 4 times across the lesson, and then obviously across the months and weeks that follow to practice that retrieval and ensure that the knowledge that they need particularly for my senior students, the knowledge that they need for later on the year, we're constantly re-getting it. And obviously using mini whiteboards as well for other sorts of check-ins. So where are we at today, guys? This is really private. Just, it's the end of term 3. You may all be feeling exhausted. Give me a clear indication of what your exhaustion levels are. And that's going to kind of shape how I decide to roll out the rest of this lesson. On your mini whiteboards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hold them up. Okay, put them back down. And straight away, I know that I've got a 1 over this side of the room and a 5 over that side of the room. And that I might even talk to that student and say, look, do you need to pop your headphones on and just do 20-minute silent study so that you can like regulate and get yourself sorted whilst I quiz these other students that are raring and ready to go. So I think that it's trusting that gut, but then asking for the confirmation that your gut has read it right or wrong and that the students are receiving what they need. I think it's just that tiny bit of extra.
I'm loving this conversation. It's evidence that we needed 6 hours rather than just 1 hour, because we've done that all on the basis of the first question, which is fantastic. I wonder if you can share a time when data, perhaps in its broadest sense, helped you to see a student more clearly, or maybe even, like you were talking about before, helped them to see themselves. Examples are often so powerful for others when they're listening to this podcast also.
Yeah. So I collect a lot of data through the marking of my students' summative assessments. They have to do 6 over the year. And I break that data down into key areas. Have they included things like data, application to the sport or the situation, command terms, knowledge, statements per mark. Now, some of that data in those questions that I feed back to the students, so I let them know my feedback to the students is very precise. So I will literally give them the letter D if they've missed out data, or K if they've missed out knowledge. And what I have found is that by having this very precise and it might have the potential to sound complicated, but it has simplified the job of the teachers that are using this sort of methodology to give feedback to students. What I've found is the students actually get to know themselves better as learners. So, for example, I've got a student that is like a beautiful, wonderful C student. They're working really hard to get those Cs, and they dearly love to move up that grade scale. So when I give them their feedback, I can also say to them at the beginning of the year, it's always trying to minimize the predictable mistakes. Like, we don't want to see mistakes for data. We don't want to see mistakes for statements per mark, or we don't want to see mistakes for application. If the question has the word soccer in it, we want to make sure their answer has the word soccer in it. But the thing that I can't help them with the thing that I can help them with and give them techniques with, but really it's on them, is the knowledge mark. So if I can get all the predictable mistakes put away by giving them like acronyms to remember to include data and those sorts of things, then it means that I get to spend 3/4 of the year really focusing on helping them learn how their brains work. So learning how information goes into their working memory and then into the long-term memory, and what kind of retrieval techniques that we can give them so that they can know that they're really, really capable of learning and retaining knowledge. And what I love about that is when you teach students how to learn, especially students that perhaps have struggled for a really long time with keeping the knowledge in their brain because they just haven't had the right techniques or been given the right support, you suddenly just start to see them flourish and their data starts to tell a very, very different story. So the grade data goes up, but also the levels of confidence. I'm sure there's some happiness data in there somewhere. And if we were at the point at my school of mapping all the data, we're very, very close to doing that, I think that we'd probably see that their well-being and all those other things would also equally go up. So I think quite often when we can utilize hard data and the quantitative stuff, and then break it down into how they can meaningfully improve that, then we get a whole lot of extra bonuses on top of that I think are probably that you're not able to quantify them.
One of the things I reflect on a lot is like, how do we provide feedback that makes people think rather than feel, right? So you can feel good or feel bad, but unless you're thinking about what you can do differently, it's difficult to act on it, right? And I was reading an article about something that Matthew talks a lot about in his work, just the dangers of data harm and what happens if there are kids who are struggling. And, it can show up in different ways. Maybe people talk about them being below grade level in literacy or in math or another subject area or your subject area. And how just kids, when they get that feedback of where they are, it just can feel very demoralizing. Like, oh my God, I'm never going to get there. And I'm really curious as to how you approach this so that kids are aware of where they are and feel that sense of ownership of their data, and we're not hiding it from them. How do you do that delicately, I guess, is where I'm wondering.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Paul. And you're speaking to the heart of one of my passions in teaching right there when we're talking feedback. So thank you. So feedback, it's sort of, over the last 5 years, I've been on a real journey to make my feedback really meaningful to my students for a couple of reasons, mostly because I want my students to shine regardless of where they see themselves on that, traditional success ladder of E to A's, but also because trying to reduce teacher workload and trying to make sure that the data and the feedback that I give to students is sustainable for me and meaningful to them. So I'm sure so many teachers are really familiar with that feeling of handing back a test, for example, and the students just want to know their mark. They're not interested. Well, as soon as they have their mark, their interest in why they got that mark has kind of been diminished and forgotten about. They're on to the next thing. Even though this assessment might come back up at the end of year exams, they've got their 83% and they're ready and they're wanting to go on to the next thing. So one of the things that I have been really struggling with is how to make the students fully engage with those test results. So I sort of started out by figuring out how I could hide the results and make them earn their results. So they had to earn the right to get the number. And by doing that, I want them to think really critically about their responses and how their responses were in comparison to the top marks that were accessible. And one of the things that I do over here in Victoria is that I mark the end of year exams, so the VCAR exams, the year 12 exams across the state. And I noticed that when we got them back to mark them and when we were learning to mark them, we get 4 worked examples. So you get 4 examples of students' work and then we judge those examples and then we get feedback on how we go from those examples. And I was like, why don't I start doing that with the kids' work? Why don't I give them an example and a non-example? So an example of a 4 out of 4 response, like the best response that I'd like to see from a student in the class. And why don't I give them a 3 out of 4 response that's like really close, not quite there, but just about there. So why don't I give them those 2 responses and get them to judge what is the better response against my mark guide and why? And so by doing that, I make the students mark 2 full tests before they're allowed to get their test back. Once they've marked those 2 full tests and looked at a wide variety of responses from across both our classes or however many classes we've got of senior PE, they then get their exam back. I then make them mark their exam. And each time to get through the next step, they need to get within sort of 2 to 5 marks of what the outcome is. So they then have to critically analyse their exam. And if they come up to ask me questions, that's a great question. I'd like you to go back and look at the 2 models and see which one you were closest to and back yourself. Like if you've made a mistake, we celebrate that mistake because we know that you've made it and hopefully that means you won't make it again later on. So by giving them those 2 models, and all those models are in students' handwritings from different students, they're obviously de-identified. Nobody really knows who wrote them except for when a student goes, yes, that was me that got the 4 out of 4. But it makes it okay to not be perfect. I think that's the thing, like, because there's always a not quite right response. It gives that feeling that it's really okay not to have the top answer. And when I go through, I know where I am with my score. And students are so, I don't think humble's the right word, but they're quite amazing because they always underscore themselves. So when they come up to me with their final answer of their exam and they say, oh, Ms. Doyle, I think I got 30 out of 40. And generally I get to turn around and high five them and say, no way, Matt, you got 34. Like, you're incredible. How good is this? It often, pretty much always, I think I've only had to give bad news once or twice. Pretty much always I get to turn around and celebrate that they've done better than they think. I think what's really important to note with that as well, though, is that we use models. Like, I'm a massive fan of models, so I use models in almost every classes. Having the mini whiteboards gives me a class set worth of models because every now and then I'll be like, turn around and look at all the answers and give a thumbs up to someone that's done a great job. And I also will say to my more resilient students, hey, this isn't perfect. This is a really common misconception. I'm going to put it up under the visualizer and let's all have a look, and I'm going to get the rest of the class to figure out what's gone wrong here so we can all improve together. So I try to make failure a really, really positive thing within my classroom so that students know that it's a safe place to fail, and all I want is for them to perform at their best and to help them get that tiny bit better. Whatever that better is, it doesn't matter what the letters or the numbers are as long as they're having a go at getting better. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Paul? Yeah.
I think that's fascinating because that also speaks to, so many educators talk about, in my school, it's safe to fail. In my school, we fail well. But that's telling a child that it's safe to fail is not the same as a child believing that it's safe to fail, right? So I wonder whether what you're describing there is kind of using authorship as a route to agency. We need children, young people to experience positive failure in order for them to feel safe to fail. So the upskilling you're using there and turning them into authors before agents, I think is a really powerful mechanism, without a doubt.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
So when you think about the teams you lead or work within, what do you notice about how data is received or resisted? And what makes it meaningful for colleagues? Rowena, why do you take this one?
I think in the arts, the uptake, the number of students taking the subject, that data really, the teachers value that. They want to know how many students are taking it. And I think the teachers also value the progress made in their subject. I think we look very much at where the students started to where they end up at the end. I think also they care a lot about the skills when they're looking at data. It's not just the knowledge. I think it comes down to within art, music and drama, seeing the students are developing skills that they can transfer, not just knowledge that can be learned today and forgotten tomorrow. yeah, I think that for the most part.
Do you think I wonder, Lizzie, if you've got thoughts on this as well? In the same way that schools and schooling can sometimes sideline and marginalize subject areas like yours, so educators in teams such as yours can see the data, this mysterious phrase. When we put a "the" next to it, suddenly it becomes powerful and reliable, right? The data isn't so relevant to them. Do you get any of that in either of your teams, that the data, as it's mandated by government or by leadership, that sometimes teachers in what can be turned into peripheral subjects? I've never seen anyone be told, I'm going to have to take you off of your math and English lessons to have more arts and PE, for instance. Yeah. So is there ever a skepticism or a suspicion about the relevance of the data in your spaces?
I think in the health and PE space, the data is really difficult in the junior year levels when you're not doing sports science or the health and human development areas. So when you're looking at our data, we really struggle, I think, in Australia, and I'm looking, if anyone's listening has got great ideas, please bring them to me. I'd love to learn more. But one of the things that we really struggle with is using the data and assessing students around things like sexuality, identity, drugs, alcohol, all those sorts of things, because how do we assess something that's just really important to know to live a meaningful life as a human being? And how can we put numbers and grades and letters to that without making it meaningless to the students? So it's a challenge that we're always deep in. And so often when we look at our junior units, there's not a huge spread of scores because it's really hard, even in our practical, it's really hard to grade students on teamwork. How do you see that? How do you create a rubric, or how do you do that in such a way that it's objective and not subjective to the person that's watching and to that particular day? So sometimes as a result of that, I think that people are like, oh, it's really easy. You don't like teaching PE or teaching those. You just play dodgeball and have conversations in the classroom. And yeah, it's just not true, but it's really hard to show people how challenging those units and teaching these things can actually be, and how we have to be so wary of what or not wary of what we're saying, but being so careful of what we're saying and trusting that gut instinct and trying to see the data as well. So it makes it really, really challenging. I think the other thing on it is that teachers see data as intimidating. When I first got asked to speak at a data in schools conference, I was like, I don't know anything about data. And just that word data freaked me out, because I was like, it's all numbers and I'm a PE teacher. So I think that quite often people that I work with will potentially hear the word data and go, we don't do data, not recognizing the vast skills and knowledge that they have for interpreting data. So, yeah.
I mean, what you're getting at there is just how when the thing that we're assessing is connected with people's identity or their personal life or other things. I was just thinking, when you're talking about drugs and sex education, other things, the people who are the most knowledgeable may not be making necessarily the best decisions about some of these things. I think the most knowledgeable people about drugs when I was in high school knew it through a fair bit of personal experience. And it's interesting because there's these sort of conflicting values. We have this value of wanting to know, to learn, to understand. But then for some of these things, there's also, we want you to make decisions or take actions in a certain way. And if you're not doing that, well, clearly you just don't understand enough. Well, maybe they do understand and they're just making different decisions. There's a lot of options there. And Rowena, thinking about the arts, someone puts out a piece of art and you're like, I give it a so-so mark. And that this kid has just put their heart and soul into this thing. I had a friend who did slam poetry, spoken word poetry. And he had this great line, which was so when you gave me a poor grade about the poem of my grandmother dying, was that because you thought that I could have expressed it more poetically, or just that you thought that she didn't die in a way that was cool enough? And I think there's something about that, like that some of these things have a certain resistance maybe to being assessed. Like it's not really about what we think about it, it's what the artist thinks about it too. How do you see that?
I think that teachers in our subjects would say that the data does not speak what we see in the classroom. It doesn't reflect the power of what has taken place over the period of time of learning. There is so much growth and learning within our subjects that cannot be measured by a number. And so I think the teachers in these subjects are, for the most part, are able to look beyond the data, and they teach their subjects for other motivating reasons other than just the grade at the end. So yes, I think they have to have a lot of faith and trust that the skeptics, the fact that our subject might only be given an hour a week as opposed to other subjects getting 5 hours, we hold on to the fact that we see its worth and value.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
There's so much in what you two have just said that could be a separate episode in itself. For instance, you could have an essay question on a data and education master's, which is a quote from you, Lissie. When you put a number or a grade on something, you make it meaningless. Discuss. Wouldn't that be a fascinating discussion in itself? And also the suggestion that somehow the arts and PE and health education are about the things that matter to live well. Flip side of that, therefore, is that the other subjects, the academic core, if you like, are not about the things that you need to live well. So there's so much in what you two are saying there about the vitality of the arts and sports and physical education, the health education, and the necessity of it being something existential there, which maybe is throwing down the gauntlet a bit to the science and math and English educators. Why should it be any different for them? Shouldn't their work be about enabling people to live well? And have they thought about how putting a number or a letter on something reduces it to something without meaning? So there's loads in what you're saying.
Yeah, and just to interject, I was just going to say, why do we send students to school in the first place? Isn't it to prepare them to navigate the big wide world and to be able to communicate and make choices and so on? I think we need to place greater value on what we get from these subjects in terms of preparing students for the future, not just to pass a test.
I wonder then, to flip it, I'm going to flip this into one more question, and I'll leave Paul to kind of tie it all together. I wonder, how do you think that other subjects than your own areas could rethink assessment within their disciplines so that what they assess better reflects learning, growth, joy, the ability to live well? And what do you think would be possible if they measured things differently? Which of you would like to go first on this?
I don't know, but maybe I don't have an answer because I don't deeply know the knowledge areas of those subjects. I can see, I don't know, maybe you should delete this because can you ask the question again?
Yeah, of course I will.
I'm thinking really hard about it.
Because you two are both talking about how assessment in your subject areas is vital. It's living, it's breathing. It's about preparing people to live well. It's about learning and growth and joy. And therefore the data, which is often reductive and stripping something of meaning through assigning a letter or a number, doesn't really play out and work in your area. So I was taking that one step forward and asking you, okay, let's think about those areas which typically and historically use the data as part and parcel of what they do and how they assess. How could they rethink assessment so that their assessment better reflects learning and growth and joy, so that their assessment enables people to live well, so that their assessment enables things to be measured differently?
I think the strength of our subjects that could be useful to other subjects is that we value the process, value the input, the growth, the struggle, the inquiry, the debate, the conversation, the collaboration, the ownership. And so I would suggest that these other subjects look to finding ways that measure or value process and progress, and not just that number at the end. And I think it's a problem within education that we measure ourselves based on that final number. I'll just give you an example. I've experienced a class who I know for fact are incredibly bright, and they haven't chosen drama because it's going to help them go to the kind of universities that they're all capable of going to. They have literally chosen it because they just get sheer joy and pleasure from being there. And I think we need to value, we want to send students off, leave schools and find jobs that they're passionate about, that they care deeply about and are engaged in. And I think a lot of students are going through education now, opting for subjects, going through processes to get that number, and it's taking out the joy and the finding work and employment that really plays to their individual skills.
I think that it's probably worth mentioning. So our school, we have these SPICE competencies, which are looking at the broader student. We're bringing them into each of our classes, so it's something that will be embedded across every single classroom. So these social competencies and cultural interconnectedness. So we're bringing that in across the whole school to look at the whole child, the whole student development. And the other thing that our school's looking at doing is bringing in the Melbourne metrics work that's looking beyond the traditional and looking at the development of the students as a whole as well. So we're in the sort of early stages of both of those at the moment. So I think that will help capture it. But I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of science and English teachers and history teachers that are probably potentially listening to this saying, we do develop the whole child. Like we do. We have these debates. We have these discussions. We talk about really, really, really hard topics in our classrooms as well. And I think that we all do that because we all love our knowledge. We all love our topics and love our areas. And through those areas, that's where we've found meaning. And we want our students to dig deeper so that they can have that same exposure to that meaning that we get.
Yeah. Just even in that question about how do we keep the data from interfering with what's most important, when I hear the two of you talking about how you're using data, what you're mostly talking about and what is clearly you're passionate about is not a term grade assessment data, right? And I think, if I could wave my magic wand and, change one thing, it would be to help people see that bigger world, that there's so much out there in terms of evidence, observations, video feedback, all sorts of things, whiteboards, that all of these things are also data and ways that we can measure it. Now, that's sort of my takeaway from this conversation. What about the two of you? If you could offer one tip of encouragement to fellow educators to use data more wisely, what would that be? What would be one thing that they might be able to change that you think could be helpful for them and for their kids?
Rowena, do you want to go? Or
No, I'll let you go. I'm still thinking, if that's okay.
yeah, that's all right. I think that mine would be the modeling. I think mine is always showing examples and non-examples, and celebrating the non-examples as much as you celebrate the examples. Like, thank you. It is such a shame that you made a mistake here, but this is such a valuable thing for us to learn from. So thanks for being brave and letting me show your answer to the rest of the class. I think we all want to know what something good looks like, so let's not hide it. Let's show the kids what the good stuff is, so that they can all raise themselves closer to that level. Yeah, some models. I'm all about the models.
Yeah, I think there's been a couple of changes to the curriculum in drama, which I'm really excited about. I don't know quite what it's going to look like yet, but one of the things that I think is really valuable is students are actually going to get marked on their process and their directing and filming key moments. And I think not always just focusing on the end product. I think if there were ways of, and I'm sure there are in maths and science, but also showing where they started and the growth in their learning and how they got from A to B, and I think would be exciting and that would be really interesting too.
I just wanted to say, before we wrap this up, we're so grateful to have you guys on this podcast. Speaking in defense of English teachers, I was an English teacher, but I've also led schools, so I'm part of that group as well. I think that we don't listen enough to the voices of educators from within your spaces. We don't listen enough to the voices of early childhood educators. And we got a special episode in this series with a couple of early childhood experts from the UK and from China. And I think these voices help us in other parts of the curriculum and at other stages of education to learn how we can all be places of growth and learning to live well and joy and human development. So I'm so grateful for you giving us these insights today.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you guys coming in.
Thank you. Total pleasure.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.